welcome to my presentation. My name is Beau Branson, and this is on Social Ontology and Ecclesiology. I specialize in philosophy of religion and metaphysics, but I'm actually new to both Social Ontology and Ecclesiology, so if I say anything particularly stupid or unconvincing, I'm eager to get feedback about any maybe literature I might be overlooking or just any kind of feedback like that. This is a work in progress, so the focus has narrowed a little bit since the abstract was submitted. I won't be hitting every topic on there, but hopefully this gives a little tighter discussion. I'm going to be focusing on diachronic questions about diachronic identity for social entities in the context of ecclesiology. But this is not about apostolic succession. So the idea of apostolic succession is that your church needs to have a bishop who can trace his ordination back all the way to the apostles. I'm going to be focusing not on the hierarchy, but on the community as a whole. So for everything that I say here, I mean, it could be the case that bishops are unnecessary. Maybe church governance just involves majority votes or something like this. Again, I'm not worried about the continuity of the hierarchy, but the diachronic identity of the community as a whole. And I'm not going to attempt to settle the questions that I raise here definitively. Basically, everything I say will be controversial, but I just want to sketch out kind of a roadmap of different kinds of ecclesiological positions you can take and sort of prima facie difficulties for each of them. So, theologians tend to organize ecclesiologies in ways that I guess make sense for them and their interests. None of them that I've seen really work very well for me, so I'm just going to kind of define 4 broad categories of ecclesiology based on how you answer 2 different questions. The questions involve continuity versus gappy existence, and duplication versus unity. So the simplest kind of view would be continuity without duplication. So for example, the Orthodox Church, the Catholic Church have views like this, that there's only one church and it started back in the book of Acts or whenever and just kind of continues on till today. You could also believe in continuity with duplication, or in other words, fission. So the branch theory would work like that. This is or was popular in Anglicanism. Says that, you have these continuous church or churches, so that you started with one church, but there's been these schisms and everything. The schisms don't mean that anyone's not part of the church. There's still just kind of one church, even though there's sort of many churches, right? It's just fissioned, right? Like a tree, so we're like branches of a tree. Those are options with continuity and with or without duplication. You could reject the idea that the church's existence has been or needs to be continuous. You could say that it has gappy existence. A gappy existence would fit the pattern of Restorationism. So views in the Radical Reformation held this, that the church ceased to exist at some point in time and then it came back into existence, or it will come back into existence. You could have gappy existence with duplication, which I think would be the worst of all possible worlds. I said that in here I have question marks, and I said maybe magisterial reform. There are some things that Luther and Calvin both say that I think sound like, if you take it very seriously, it would commit them to this view. I doubt that anyone would intentionally want to be committed to such a view. Anyway, so I just put question marks there. I don't know what to say about that. But I'm going to go through problems for duplication and problems with gappy existence. I'm also going to talk about some problems with continuity, but I think there may be lesser in my view. So let's talk about that first. It's pretty easy to define gappy existence. Your existence is gappy if there's a point in time where you exist, and then there's a point in time later where you exist, and then there's a point between those 2 times where you don't exist. So that's your gap. Continuity is less easy to define, so I'm kind of punting on that for now, but I can give some analogies. It does require something more than just negating gappy existence, because you could have things kind of switching their identities around willy-nilly. So for example, I go to sleep in the United States of America, and maybe when I wake up, it's no longer America, it's Mexico, and what used to be Mexico is America, because their identities have just switched places. That would obviously violate continuity in any kind of intuitive sense, but it wouldn't require gappy existence, right? There could be no gap in the existence of these entities, but if they just sort of switch identity around willy-nilly, then there's no continuity either. So continuity requires more than just denying gappy existence, but it's kind of hard to say what. But here's some analogies. In the literature on personal identity and on just the persistence of particulars through time, it's very common to appeal to some kind of causal continuity. So what makes things, people and things identical over time is that they are causally related to earlier stages of themselves or whatever. Peter Van Inwagen has a view kind of like this, that material particles are caught up in the life of a biological organism. That is what constitutes the existence of the biological organism and is involved in its diachronic identity. You require these metabolic processes whereby the biological entity can incorporate new matter and expel old matter over time. So take an analogy here. Let's say formal social entities are ones that have well-defined rules by which the entity or one of its agents can add and remove members. So, for example, a corporation will have bylaws and hiring policies that tell you how to hire and fire people or add people to the board of directors or whatever. A nation will have laws specifying how someone comes to be or ceases to be a citizen. Informal social entities can add and subtract members in ways that are maybe more organic, though, and probably not susceptible to a clear definition. So, for example, a circle of friends. It's hard to give a precise definition of continuity, but hopefully these characterizations and analogies go some way towards clarifying it. The upshot, of course, is that continuity seems to rule out gappy existence. And that's going to be a problem for restorationism. So restorationism can be broken down into a couple of claims. First, the great apostasy theory says that at some point in time, the church ceased to exist. Usually the idea is that there's a breakdown in doctrine or morals or some event where Christians just kind of all apostatized at the same time. Restoration says that at some point in time, the church has come back into existence or will come back into existence. Obviously, if gappy existence isn't possible, then restoration isn't possible. Interestingly, just to note, the great apostasy theory could be possible without restoration, even if you think there's no gappy existence. So you could just say the church ceased to exist, and it would just sort of be a conceptual impossibility for it to ever come back into existence. I don't know anyone who holds that. It would be a pretty depressing view, but it would be coherent. Well, so there's some problems for continuity. It's a little bit hard to define it, but however you define it, it seems like it's a problem for restorationism. So that may or may not be a problem in your mind, depending on whether you're a restorationist or not. Suppose we reject continuity and say, okay, continuity is not going to be required. I think that then raises some problems for unity and duplication and for church discipline. So if continuity is not going to be a necessary condition on diachronic identity, we have two options. I'll call it ecclesiological internalism. Says the diachronic identity of the church is purely dependent on the intrinsic features of a social entity that claims to be the church. Ecclesiological externalism, not requiring continuity, would say that the diachronic identity of the church depends on some extrinsic feature. It's just not continuity with the church at some earlier time. So the continuity criterion is a kind of externalism, but here since we're assuming we're going to reject that, we're just looking at what's left over. So that would be internalism or externalism without the continuity. And we'll just go through both of those in turn. So problems for ecclesiological internalism, the biggest one is just duplication. So there's no reason that two distinct social entities couldn't be qualitatively indiscernible with respect to their intrinsic properties. So think about it just as sort of standard twin Earth thought experiment. Maybe you couldn't have a twin Jesus. So let's say you start out with two planets that have different early histories, but their histories converge at a certain point, and then they never diverge. So at the point where their histories converge, you suddenly have two qualitatively indiscernible churches that are distinct from each other. But if those intrinsic qualitative features of theirs are sufficient for identity with the church, then you've got two things that are distinct from each other but identical to something else. So given endurantism, which says diachronic identity just is identity, it seems like you just get incoherence, right? You've got these two churches on two planets. They're distinct from each other, but they're both literally identical to this previous stage of the church, and I guess literally identical to just the church. Seems to violate the transitivity of identity. Perdurantists a lot of times think they can make sense out of these kind of fission and duplication cases. Perdurantism says diachronic identity is not literal identity. It's just a matter of different temporal parts of something being parts of a larger four-dimensional object, the same larger four-dimensional object. That's controversial. I'm not going to get into whether that does work or not. Let's just grant that perdurantism could kind of salvage this duplication view. I think it raises a problem with church discipline, and I'm going to give the example here of poor old Jimmy Swaggart. So Jimmy Swaggart was an Assemblies of God minister, became one of the most popular televangelists in the 1980s. In 1988, he's caught cheating on his on his wife with a prostitute, and gives this famous "I have sinned" speech on the air. I'll just play a little clip here.
I have sinned against you, my Lord, and I would ask that your precious blood would wash and cleanse.
Anyway, I'm not going to play the whole thing. He gives this big teary-eyed speech and everything about how he needs to be forgiven, blah, blah, blah. Well, this is without explicitly admitting it, but he's basically admitting it. So the Assemblies of God immediately suspends him for 3 months and then kind of deliberates about what to do, and eventually they extend that to 2 years, which in fact was just their standard policy for sexual immorality. It's just kind of they, immediately suspended him for 3 months and then deliberated about it and said, okay, final answer is going to be 2 years, which was just their standard thing. Swaggart resumes preaching after just the 3 months, apparently just in willful defiance of their final decision. So they see that as a lack of repentance, and so they defrock him. They say, hey, we said you got to cool it for 2 years. You didn't, so we're defrocking you. So what happens? Swaggart just starts a non-denominational ministry and continues preaching as usual. And then he's caught with another prostitute a few years later. So the question is, why worry about being disciplined by your church if you can just go to a different church or start your own church? The existence of multiple churches or the possibility of starting your own seems to make serious disciplinary action by a church, like defrocking or excommunication, impossible or at best largely pointless. So duplication, I argue, threatens the possibility of the church effectively engaging in any kind of meaningful disciplinary action. And I also want to ask whether a Swaggart-like scenario was ever envisioned by the New Testament authors. This is going to be super controversial. I said everything controversial. Biblical interpretation is always controversial. But consider in 1 Corinthians 5, you've got this man who's found fornicating with his father's wife, which hopefully just means like his stepmother. And Paul tells the Corinthians to expel him from the church. It seems like if you expel the guy from the church, but then you just go down the street to a different church, that seems sort of pointless. Now, you could counter that and say, yeah, but I think it is just the local church. I think he just meant for the Corinthians to kick him out of their church. I don't think that's super plausible, but let's put that aside. The next chapter is, I think, even tougher. Paul says, dare any of you, having a matter against another, go to law before the unrighteous and not before the saints? In other words, he's talking about taking another Christian to a civil court rather than just to other Christians in the church. He says, "Do you not know that the saints will judge the world? And if the world will be judged by you, are you unworthy to judge the smallest matters?" He talks in another verse here that I deleted about judging angels. But anyway, he says, Is it so that there's not a wise man among you, not even one, who will be able to judge between his brethren? But brother goes to law against brother, and that before unbelievers." Right? So he seems to think of the church as being able to take the place of civil courts. But think of an analogy here. I mean, think if there were multiple civil courts that were all kind of overlapping in a single jurisdiction. So I could sue you, or you could sue me, and if we don't get the result that we want, just go to a different court down the street and do the same lawsuit all over again. Or, a judge gives me a certain sentence or whatever, and I just go, I just ignore it and start my own courtroom up, and I'm the judge in that courtroom, and I rule in favor of myself. That just doesn't seem like that would work, right? Jesus says something similar. He says, "If your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault between you and him alone. If he won't hear it, take with you one or two more. And if he refuses to hear them, tell it to the church. But if he refuses to hear even the church, let him be to you like a heathen and a tax collector." Right? But again, I mean, can that church just be duplicated, right? If you tell this to the whole church, I mean, I don't listen to that church, but what do I just start my own church, and then I listen to that church because that church is led by me, or whatever. It just doesn't seem like the sort of disciplinary action that's envisioned here would be workable if you've got multiple churches. It seems like the New Testament authors envision the church as an entity capable of serious disciplinary action, but duplication seems to threaten that. So the result here is that ecclesiological internalism leads to duplication. Depending on whether you pair that with indurantism or perdurantism, you either get incoherence or, at a minimum, this problem with church discipline. But if you reject continuity then and reject ecclesiological internalism, the only thing left here is the option of externalism without continuity. So what would these other extrinsic features be that would get us diachronic identity with the church that wouldn't be continuity? The only thing I can think of is what I'll just call Mormon style or Islamic style restorationism. So the claim made in both of these groups is that you've just got this direct relation to God. So Muhammad gets a revelation directly from Gabriel, Joseph Smith directly from God and Jesus or whatever. Prose, you could avoid duplication there because it's not just intrinsic features. You could avoid Gappy existence because the church can still exist in heaven even if there's a great apostasy on earth. And you could have meaningful disciplinary action because you can have just a single church, right? The problem I see with that is a problem about epistemology. So continuity gives you a tangible criterion for what counts as the church. But if that's not sufficient, then how do you know which entity is the church? Is it the Islamic Ummah, the Latter-day Saints, the Church of Christ? They can't all be the one church. Is it the Islamic Ummah, the Latter-day Saints, the Church of Christ? They can't all be the one church, or else we get duplication and the problem of church discipline again. But then which one is the church? And without continuity, how do I know? As far as other options for other extrinsic features, I just don't know what other extrinsic features would be relevant to the diachronic identity of the church. So it remains an open possibility, but I don't really see how that option would work otherwise. So in conclusion, duplication with indurantism seems to be incoherent. With perdurantism, you get the problem of church discipline. I didn't mention ecclesiological anti-realism and this other stuff in this talk, but other versions, I think, give you problems with church discipline. It's hard to see how you could eliminate duplication except with some kind of externalism. The externalism without continuity seems to face this epistemological problem. Continuity seems to eliminate, on the other hand, the possibility of Gappy existence and therefore restorationism, and it's also in need of a more precise definition. those are my conclusions. It's kind of a conclusion without conclusions. I'm looking forward to your comments, so thanks a lot.